Hello everyone, welcome. I was going to talk today a little bit more about the conflict in the Near East, Middle East, but I decided against it. I was going to talk about it because I could hardly sleep last night. I actually woke up a number of times, deeply troubled, because I had heard just before I went to bed, I had heard about two incidents that really worried me, source of a lot of anguish. One was that there were some young people in Israel who were actually watching the shelling of Gaza and so on from a hill, and they were applauding and shouting, yeah. I don't know whether that is true. I thought it was perhaps a little bit too much. Perhaps it was an exaggeration. So I don't know. But the second one was in the United States. And it was an address that the new Speaker of the House, whose name I choose to forget, was delivering. He was addressing this a group of people, quite large, and he said that the first priority was Israel, and no, there would not be a ceasefire, and he wasn't going to support that. And then all these people together started chanting, "No ceasefire, no ceasefire," and they continued like that for quite a while. Now, ceasefire is not an extreme position to take in what is happening. I was wondering what made those young people shout that. As if it was a video game or a football team or something. No ceasefire, they were saying. Well, I just hope that those people's consciences haunts them for a long time. So, no, I'm not going to. I had some notes ready to discuss with you about this conflict, but I said no, I really don't want to do that. So I decided to, in my little library here, I just thought, let me do something completely different, just to get my mind off it. Perhaps yours too. And I found something that you might find interesting. Aleksadr Solzhenitsyn, it's a speech that he gave in 1976 in England over the BBC radio network, March 24th, 1976. So the Soviet Union is still there. He was freed. He was in the West. He had been here for about 2 years, I believe, in the West. And he began to notice that perhaps the West was not the ideal paradise that he had always dreamt of. And of course, he has his famous speech at Harvard University. And from then on, he was greatly admired until that point, and then the West decided that they didn't particularly like him anymore, and he ended up going back to the Soviet Union. But his problem with the West was that he saw the shortcomings in his own culture, obviously, and he wrote extensively about it, as you know. the ferocity of the punishments and all that sort of thing. Also about the suffering of the Russian people. But of the West, he said that we were declining. He used words much stronger than that. We were practically committing suicide, he would say at some times. Why? Because we lacked courage to defend our traditions, our culture. He goes back to abandoning God and the moral rules and so on from the Enlightenment onwards. And he makes a case for the fact that we have in our prosperity and we delight in our prosperity, we no longer dare do the impossible sometimes. And it's not very long, so I'm going to read it to you. Of course, it's a different time, 1976, but bear in mind what he was addressing. His disappointment with the West, who had lost their sense of morals. And from there on, everything goes, in his opinion, everything just goes down. Here it is. The BBC has been kind enough to invite me to give my opinion as a foreigner and an exile on the West as it is today, and particularly on England. Perhaps an outside view might be able to contribute something fresh. My only hope is that you will not find what I have to say too tedious. I admit I am not all that well acquainted with the internal affairs of your country, but like so many Russians, I have always followed Britain's foreign affairs with the keenest interest. I intend to speak frankly, and I shall not try to please you or to flatter you in any way. I would ask you to believe me when I say nothing could give me more pleasure than to express only admiration. A quarter of a century ago, in the labor camps of Kazakhstan, as we braced ourselves for our hopeless task of stemming the communist tanks, the West represented the light of freedom. For us, the West was not only the stronghold of the spirit, but also the depository of wisdom. In that very year, one of your ministers, Herbert Morrison, somehow managed to persuade Pravda, the newspaper, to devote an entire page to a statement of his without any censorship. My God, how eagerly we rushed to where the paper was displayed, a crowd of convicts with shaven heads, filthy jackets, clumsy prison camp boots. This was it. At last, our subterranean kingdom was going to be pierced with the bright diamond heart ray of truth and hope. At last, Soviet censorship, held for 40 years in the grip of a bulldog's jaws, was to be relaxed. Now he'd make them see the truth. Now he'd stand up for us. But as we read and reread that feeble, insipid article, our hopes subsided slowly. These were the superficial words of someone who had not the slightest idea of the savage structure, the pitiless aims of the communist world. And of course this was precisely why Pravda so generously agreed to print them. We had endured 40 years of hell, and this British Prime Minister could find no word of hope for us. The years went by. The decades went by. In spite of the Iron Curtain, views on what was happening in the West, what people were thinking about, kept coming through to us, mainly thanks to the BBC's Russian broadcasts, although they were vigorously jammed. And the more we learned, the more the state of your world perplexed us. Human nature is full of riddles and contradictions. Its very complexity engenders art. And by art I mean the search for something more than simple linear formulations, flat solutions, oversimplified explanations. One of these riddles is, how is it that people who have been crushed by the sheer weight of slavery and cast to the bottom of the pit can nevertheless find the strength to rise up and free themselves, first in spirit and then in body? While those who soar unhampered over the peaks of freedom suddenly lose the taste for freedom, lose the will to defend it, and hopelessly confused and lost, almost begin to crave slavery? Or again, why is it that societies which have been benumbed for half a century by lies they have been forced to swallow find within themselves a certain lucidity of heart and soul which enables them to see things in their true perspective and to perceive the real meaning of events? Whereas societies with access to every kind of information suddenly plunged into lethargy, into a kind of mass blindness, a kind of voluntary self-deception. This is precisely what we have found to be the correlation between the spiritual development of the East and that of the West. And alas, the process of your development is 5, if not 10 times swifter than ours. This is what almost robs mankind of any hope of avoiding a global catastrophe. For years we refused to believe this, thinking that the information which reached us was inadequate. A few years ago I spoke of this with considerable alarm in my Nobel lecture. And yet, until I came to the West myself and spent 2 years looking around, I could never have imagined the extreme degree to which the West actually desired to blind itself to the world situation, the extreme degree to which the West had already become a world without a will, a world gradually petrifying in the face of the danger confronting it, a world oppressed above all by the need to defend its freedom. There is a German proverb which runs Mut verloren, alles verloren. When courage is lost, all is lost. There is another Latin one according to which loss of reason is the true harbinger of destruction. But what happens to a society in which both these losses, the loss of courage and the loss of reason, intersect? This is the picture which I found the West presents today. Of course, there is a perfectly simple explanation for this process. It is not the superficial one, so fashionable in our day, that man himself is irreproachable and everything is to be blamed on a badly organized society, but a purely human one. Once it was proclaimed and accepted that above man there was no supreme being, but instead that man was the crowning glory of the universe and the measure of all things, and that man's needs, desires, and indeed his weaknesses were taken to be the supreme imperatives of the universe. Consequently, the only good in the world, the only thing that needed to be done, was that which satisfied our feelings. It was several centuries ago in Europe that this philosophy was born. At the time, its materialistic excesses were explained away by previous excesses of Catholicism. But in the course of several centuries, this philosophy inexorably flooded the entire Western world and gave it confidence for its colonial conquests, for the seizures of African and Asian slaves. And all these side by side with the outward manifestations of Christianity and the flowering of personal freedom. By the beginning of the 20th century, these philosophies seem to have reached the height of civilization and reason. And your country, Britain, which had always been the core, the very pearl of the Western world, gave expression with particular brilliance to this philosophy in both its good and its bad aspects. In 1914, at the beginning of our ill-fated 20th century, a storm broke over this civilization, a storm the size and range of which no one at the time could grasp. For 4 years, Europe destroyed herself as never before, and in 1917, a crevasse opened up on the very edge of Europe, a yawning gap enticing the world into an abyss. The causes for this rupture are not hard to find. It was the logical result of doctrines that had been bandied about in Europe for ages and had enjoyed considerable success. But this crevasse has something cosmic about it, too, in its unplumbed, unsuspected depths, in its unimaginable capacity for growing wider and wider and swallowing up more and more people. 40 years earlier, Dostoevsky had predicted that socialism would cost Russia 100 million victims. At the time, it seemed an improbable figure. Let me ask the British press to acquaint its readers with the impartial 3-page report of the Russian statistician Professor Ivan Kurganov. It was published in the West 12 years ago, but as is so often the case with matters of social significance, we only notice things that are not contradictory to our own feelings. From Professor Kurganov's analysis, we learn that if Dostoevsky erred, he erred on the side of understatement. From 1917 to 1959, socialism cost the Soviet Union 110 million lives. When there is a geological upheaval, continents do not topple into the sea immediately. The first thing that happens is that the fatal initial crevasse must appear someplace. For a variety of reasons, it so happened that this first opened up in Russia, but it might just as well have been anywhere else. And Russia, which people considered a backward country, had to leap forward a whole century to overtake all the other countries in the world. We endured inhuman experiences which the Western world, and this includes Britain, has no real conception of and is frightened even to think about. It is with a strange feeling that those of us who come from the Soviet Union look upon the West of today. It is as though we were neither neighbors on the same planet nor contemporaries. And yet we contemplate the West from what will be your future, or we look back 70 years to see our past suddenly repeating itself today. And what we see is always the same as it was then. Adults deferring to the opinion of their children. The younger generation carried away by shallow, worthless ideas. Professors scared of being unfashionable. Journalists refusing to take responsibility for the words they squander so easily. Universal sympathy for revolutionary extremists. People with serious objections unable or unwilling to voice them. The majority passively obsessed by a feeling of doom. Feeble governments. Societies whose defensive reactions have become paralyzed. Spiritual confusion leading to political upheaval. What will happen as a result of all this lies ahead of us. But the time is near, and from bitter memory we can easily predict what these events will be. In the years which followed the worldwide upheaval of 1917, that pragmatic philosophy on which present-day Europe was nourished, with its refusal to take moral decisions, reached its logical conclusion. Since there are no higher spiritual forces above us, and since I, man with a capital M, I am the crowning glory of the universe, then if anyone must perish today, let it be someone else, anybody, but not I, not my precious self, or those who are close to me. The apocalyptic storm was already raging over the land that used to be Russia, when Western Europe speedily extricated itself from that terrible war in its haste to forget and to bring back prosperity, fashions, and the latest dances. Lloyd George actually said, "Forget about Russia. It is our job to ensure the welfare of our own society." 1914, when the Western democracies needed help, they were not averse to appealing to Russia. But in 1919, those Russian generals who, for 3 years, had fought to save the Marne, the Somme, and Verdun, straining Russian resources to the very limit, were refused military aid or even an alliance by their Western friends. Many Russian soldiers lay buried in French soil. Others who had gone to Constantinople were charged for their rations or had their underwear confiscated in lieu of payment. They were then cajoled into returning to Russia only to be dealt with by the Bolsheviks, or into embarking for Brazil only to become semi-slaves on coffee plantations. And seemingly deeds are usually accompanied by high-sounding, even brilliant justifications. In 1919, no one said openly, "What do your sufferings have to do with us?" Instead, people said, "We have no right to support even the authority of an ally against the wishes of the people." Note, however, that in 1945, when millions of Soviet citizens had to be handed over for dispatch to the Gulag archipelago, this argument was conveniently twisted. "We have no right to carry out the wishes of these millions," it was said, "and to ignore our obligation toward the authorities of an allied country." How easily one's egoism can be satisfied by a handy formula. But there were even nobler justifications than this. What was happening in Russia was nothing more than a continuation of all that had happened in 18th and 19th century Europe, a repetition of the general transition from liberalism to socialism. This tendency of ideas to continue on their natural course made people admire them. And so all the aggressive elements, all the influential elements in society, and this was especially the case in Britain, admired what they call the unprecedented progressive experiment taking place in the USSR, while we were being strangled by the cancerous tentacles of the Gulag archipelago, while millions of hard-working peasants were being sent to die in Siberia in midwinter. Not a single Western newspaper printed photographs or reports of the famine. Indeed, your great wit George Bernard Shaw even denied its existence. "Famine in Russia," he said, "I've never dined so well or so sumptuously as when I crossed the Soviet border." For whole decades, your rulers, your members of parliament, your spokesmen, your journalists, your writers, your leading thinkers managed to ignore the 15 million strong Gulag archipelago. Up to 30 books on the Gulag were published in Europe before mine, and hardly one of them was even noticed. There is a borderline beyond which the natural cause of progressive principles of the dawn of the new era becomes nothing more than calculated, conscious hypocrisy. For this makes life more comfortable to live. There was, however, one great exception over the last 100 years or so, and that was your struggle with Adolf Hitler, when Britain cast overboard the philosophy of pragmatism or utilitarianism, the philosophy of recognizing any group of gangsters, any puppets, as head of a country so long as they control its territory. Britain assumed a moral stance against Hitler, and it was this that inspired her to one of the most heroic acts of resistance in her history. A moral stance, even in politics, always safeguards our spirit. Sometimes, as we can see, it even protects our very existence. A moral stance can suddenly turn out to be more far-sighted than any calculated pragmatism. Your war with Hitler, however, was not tragic in the Aristotelian sense of the word. Your sacrifices, sufferings, and losses were justified. They did not run counter to the aims of the war. You defended and successfully defended precisely that which you intended to defend. But for the people of the USSR, the war was a tragic war. We were forced to defend our native land with all the strength we could muster, and with infinitely greater losses. Kurvanov's figure are indisputable, 44 million. And in so doing, to strengthen all the things that we most loathe, the power of our own executioners, our oppression, our destruction, and, as we can see today, ultimately, your destruction too. And when those millions of Soviet citizens dared to flee from their oppressors or even to initiate national liberation movements, then our freedom-loving Western allies, not least among them you British, treacherously disarmed them, bound them, and handed them over to the communists to be killed. They were sent to labor camps in the Urals, where they mined uranium for the atom bombs which were to be used against you yourselves. Nor do you shrink from using the butts of your rifles on 70-year-olds, those very men who had been Britain's allies in the First World War and who were now being hastily handed over to be murdered. From the British Isles alone, 100,000 Soviet citizens were forcibly repatriated, while on the continent the number was more than 1 million. But the most remarkable thing of all was that your free, independent, incorruptible press, your famous Times, Guardian, New Statement, etc., all wittingly shared in the cover-up of this crime, and would have kept silent to this very day had not Professor Julius Epstein from America so tactlessly started his investigations into the fascist techniques that democracies are capable of employing. The conspiracy of the British press was only too successful. Indeed, there must be many people in Britain today who have not the faintest idea about this crime committed at the end of the Second World War, but it was committed, and it has left a deep and painful mark on the Russian memory. Twice we helped save the freedom of Western Europe, and twice you repaid us by abandoning us to our slavery. It is clear what you wanted. Once again you wanted to extricate yourselves as quickly as possible from this terrible war. You wanted to rest. You wanted to prosper. But there was a price to pay. The noble philosophy of pragmatism proclaimed that once again you should close your eyes to a great many things, to the deportation of whole nations to Siberia, to Katyn, to Warsaw, that same country for whose sake the war had started, that you should forget Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania. You should hand over 6 more of your European sisters into slavery and allow a 7th to be cut in 2. At Nuremberg, you should sit amicably side by side with judges who were just as much murderers as those on trial, and never let this disturb your British sense of justice. Whenever a new tyranny came into existence, however far away, in China, say, or Laos, Britain was always the first to recognize it, eagerly pushing aside all competitors for the honor. All this required great moral fortitude, and your society was not found lacking. All one had to do was to repeat again and again the magic formula, the dawn of a new era. You whispered it, you shouted it, and when you grew sick of it and decided to reaffirm your valor in the eyes of the world and recover your self-respect, then your country manifested incomparable daring against Iceland, against Spain, countries which could not even answer you back. Tank columns in East Berlin, Budapest and Prague declared that they were there by the will of the people, but not once did the British government recall its ambassadors from any of these places in protest. In Southeast Asia, unknown numbers of prisoners have been killed and are still being killed in secret. Yet the British ambassadors have not been recalled. Every day in the Soviet Union, psychiatrists murder people with their hypodermic syringes merely because they do not think along accepted lines or because they believe in God, and again the British ambassador is never recalled. But when 5 terrorists who actually committed murder were executed in Madrid, then the British ambassador was recalled, and the din reverberated throughout the world. What a hurricane burst forth from the British Isles! You have to know how to protest. It has to be done with a great deal of anger, but only as long as it doesn't run counter to the spirit of the age and presents no danger to the authority of those protesting. If only you could make use of your British skepticism for a moment, it can't have deserted you entirely, and put yourselves in the position of the oppressed peoples of Eastern Europe, then you can view your unseemly behavior through our eyes. The Prime Minister of Spain was murdered, and all cultured Europe was delighted. Some Spanish policemen, even some Spanish hairdressers, were murdered, and the countries of Europe went wild with joy, as if their own police were insured against the terrorist international. Not a single family driving to an airport can be sure that it won't be gunned down by some fighter for someone or other's freedom. No one can be sure that he'll get to the end of the street safe and sound. But terrorists can be sure. Public opinion guarantees that their lives will be safe, that their cause will be given publicity, and that they will be held in decent confinement. That is, until other terrorists come and rescue them. A society for the protection of terrorists, indeed. There was such a society in Russia before her collapse. We too have trodden this fatal path. Meanwhile, the crevasse grows ever wider, spreads even farther across the globe, shifts into other continents. The most populous country in the world has plunged headlong into it. So have a dozen others. So too have numerous defenseless tribes, the Kurds, Northern Abyssinians, Somalis, Angolans. And the British, with their great tradition of freedom, haven't the slightest anxiety over such petty matters. Even today you are lulled into thinking that these fine islands of yours will never be split in two by that crevasse, will never be blown sky high. And yet the abyss is already there, beneath your very feet. Every year several more countries are seized and taken over as bridgeheads for the coming world war, and the whole world stands by and does nothing. Even the oceans are being taken over, and need one tell you, British, what that means or what the seas will be used for? And what of Europe today? It is nothing more than a collection of cardboard stage sets, all bargaining with each other to see how little can be spent on defense in order to leave more for the comforts of life. The continent of Europe, with its centuries-long preparation for the task of leading mankind, has of its own accord abandoned its strength and its influence on world affairs, and not just its physical influence, but its intellectual influence as well. Potentially important decisions, major movements have now begun to mature beyond the frontiers of Europe. How strange it all is! Since when has mighty Europe needed outside help to defend herself? At one moment she had such a surfeit of strength that, while waging wars within her own boundaries and destroying herself, she was still able to seize colonies. A moment later, she suddenly found herself hopelessly weak without having lost a single major war. However hidden it may be from human gaze, however unexpected for the practical mind, there is sometimes a direct link between the evil we cause to others and the evil which suddenly confront us. Pragmatists may explain this link as a chain of natural cause and effect, but those who are more inclined to a religious view of life will immediately perceive a link between sin and punishment. It can be seen in the history of every country. Today's generation has had to pay for the shortcomings of their fathers and grandfathers who blocked their ears to the lamentations of the world and closed their eyes to its miseries and disasters. Your newspapers may be famous for their traditions, but they print a number of articles containing analysis and commentaries which are shamefully shallow and short-sighted. What can one say when your leading liberal paper compares the contemporary development of the Russian spiritual regeneration with pigs trying to fly? This is not just contempt for the spiritual potential of my people. It is broader than that. It's a kind of fastidious contempt for any kind of spiritual regeneration, for anything which does not stem directly from economics, but which is based on moral criteria. What an inglorious end to 400 years of materialism. The decline of contemporary thought has been hastened by the misty phantom of socialism. Socialism has created the illusion of quenching people's thirst for justice. Socialism has lulled their conscience into thinking that the steamroller which is about to flatten them is a blessing in disguise, a salvation. And socialism, more than anything else, has caused public hypocrisy to thrive. It has enabled Europe to ignore the annihilation of 66 million people on its very borders. There is not even a single precise definition of socialism that is generally recognized. All we have is a sort of hazy, shimmering concept of something good, something noble, so that two socialists talking to each other about socialism might just as well be talking about completely different things. And, of course, any new-style African dictator can call himself a socialist without fear of contradiction. But socialism defies logic. You see, it is an emotional impulse, a kind of worldly religion. And nobody has the slightest need to study or even to read the teachings of its early prophets. Their books are judged by hearsay. Their conclusions are accepted ready-made. Socialism is defended with a passionate lack of reason. It is never analyzed. It's proof against all criticism. Socialism, especially Marxist socialism, uses the neat device of declaring all serious criticism outside the framework of possible discussion, and one is required to accept 95% of socialist doctrine as a basis for discussion. All that is left to argue about is the remaining 5%. There is another myth here too, namely that socialism represents a sort of ultra-modern structure, an alternative to dying capitalism, and yet it existed ages and ages before any sort of capitalism. My friend academician Igor Shafarevich has shown in his extensive study of socialism that socialist systems, which are being used today to lure us to some great future, made up the greatest portion of the previous history of mankind in the ancient East, in China, and were repeated later in the bloody experiments of the Reformation. As for socialist doctrines, he has shown that they emerged far later, but have still been with us for over 2,000 years. and that they originated not in the eruption of progressive thought, as people think nowadays, but as a reaction, Plato's reaction against Athenian democracy, the Gnostics' reaction against Christianity, against the dynamic world of individualism, and as a return to the impersonal, stagnant system of antiquity. And if we follow the explosive sequence of socialist doctrines and socialist utopias preached in Europe by Campanella, Winstanley, Morelli, Deschamps, Babeuf, Fourier, Marx, and dozens of others, we cannot help but shudder as they openly proclaim certain features of that terrible form of society. It is about time we call upon right-minded socialists calmly and without prejudice to read, say, a dozen of the major works of the major prophets of European socialism and to ask themselves, is this really that social ideal for which they would prepare to sacrifice the lives of countless others and even to sacrifice their own? You imagine you see danger in other parts of the globe, and so you hurl the arrows from your depleted quiver there. But the greatest danger of all is that you have lost the will to defend yourselves. Great Britain, the kernel of the Western world, has experienced this sapping of its strength and will to an even greater degree perhaps than any other country. For some 20 years, Britain's voice has not been heard in our planet. Its character has gone, its freshness has faded, and Britain's position in the world today is of less significance than that of Romania or even Uganda. British common sense, so lucid, so universally acknowledged, seems to have failed her now. Contemporary society in Britain is living on self-deception and illusions, both in the world of politics and in the world of ideas. People build rickety structures to convince themselves that there is no danger and that its irrevocable advance is nothing more than the establishment of a stable world. We, the oppressed people of Russia, the oppressed people of Eastern Europe, watch with anguish the tragic enfeeblement of Europe. We offer you the experience of our suffering. We would like you to accept it without having to pay the monstrous price of death and slavery that we have paid. But your society refuses to heed our warning voices. I suppose we must admit, sad though it is, that experience cannot be transmitted. Everyone must experience everything for himself. Of course, it's not just a question of Britain. It's not just a question of the West. It concerns all of us in the East as well as in the West. We are all, each in his own way, bound together by a common fate, by the same bands of iron. And all of us are standing on the brink of a great historical cataclysm, a flood that swallows up civilization and changes whole epochs. The present world situation is complicated still more by the fact that several hours have struck simultaneously on the clock of history. We all must face up to a crisis, not just the social crisis, not just the political crisis, not just the military crisis, face up to it, but also stand firm in this great upheaval, an upheaval similar to that which marked the transition from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance. Just as mankind once became aware of the intolerable and mistaken deviation of the late Middle Ages and recoiled in horror from it, so too must we take account of the disastrous deviation of the late Enlightenment. We have become hopelessly enmeshed in our slavish worship of all that is pleasant, all that is comfortable, all that is material. We worship things, we worship products. Will we ever succeed in shaking off this burden, in giving free rein to the spirit that was breathed into us at birth, that spirit which distinguishes us from the animal world? And that was the end of the lecture he gave on the radio in 1976. And of course, Eastern Europe was still under the Soviet Union. And of course, socialism at the time was very fashionable. Okay. Still, we can learn something from this speech, I think. Thank you very much for listening. Bye-bye.